Hey, thank you. Thank you, Kieran, for the introduction and for inviting me to present at this seminar series. It's really exciting, and it's exciting to just to know that these topics are only gaining in interest and momentum. And there's been a bit of interest in this talk from people who are here and people who are planning on watching it later, from not just theatre, film, television, performance studies, but also lots of other disciplines or practitioners or other interests. So I've tried to write it to kind of be sort of broad enough and specific enough, and hopefully not get bogged in any jargon, but be relevant to different types of listeners. So I hope, whatever perspective you're listening from, you find something in it that you find enjoyable and useful. So my background in performance media and sport, I did a PhD almost a decade ago with the Department of Theatre and Performance Studies at the University of Sydney. And I used mountain biking as a kind of a playground to find almost a billion. Oh, we've got some noise from someone who's just coming in, I think. So lots of case studies from mountain biking to kind of look at what we could learn about sport by looking at it through performance studies, but also what we can learn about performance studies by investigating sport, which wasn't so trendy at the time, but it is now, which is why I'm so excited. One of my motivations at the time was, when people talk about being in the zone or being in flow, and this idea that minds go blank. And for me as a mountain biker, I just don't buy it. I can't. It's like if people are racing down, a track with stuff everywhere and people falling over in front of them and the crowd yelling stuff, and maybe looking at a flag to see if it's windy and they need to adjust the way they go into a jump. I think there's actually all kinds of stuff going on that is some kind of thoughtful awareness, decision-making processes. So, I guess that was one of the things for me is, well, what are minds doing? Are they going blank or is something else happening? So that's kind of led me into cognitive science, where I've worked part-time for the last 6 years at Macquarie University, and also sports journalism, which I'm not talking about today, except to say that a lot of this research really informs the approaches that I take to journalism, and it always gives you a fresh angle to put on stories or a way of getting into the experience of sport, which is really helpful when it's so competitive for attention in that area, or how to pitch a story. I'm currently working with a team that we call the Cognitive Ecologies Lab in Cognitive Science at Macquarie Uni. And I just wanted to briefly introduce this team because they're, it's had various iterations over the years. This is one iteration of people and name. They're all people with an interest in interdisciplinary approaches to thinking about how we perform and how we think. And they're all people with rich practical expertise in some kind of physical activity. And that gives them a real kind of direct interest into the theory, but also what theory brings to practice. And I hope some of that comes through today. One chapter I found really interesting when I was starting to kind of wander in the cognitive science world was this one by Lynn Tribble and John Sutton about performance studies and cognitive science. And they warn against the danger of just sampling from other disciplines when doing interdisciplinary research, and not, maybe picking up something topical or trendy, but not really understanding the debates that are surrounding it. So that sometimes happens with things like mirror neurons. And I think that's the example they give in this chapter. They note the tendency of some researchers in the sciences to just really ignore cultural, social, historical situation specificity in the case studies and examples and discussions that they use and have. And that's something, I guess, one of my bugbears sometimes, although there is a lot of work that is starting to do this really well. But they also note the tendency of researchers in the humanities, not all researchers, but there can be a tendency to kind of glorify some scientific findings or ignore them when they might be really relevant to the research that they're doing too. Or something John said later was, sometimes they just simplify it. Like in the humanities, we love complexity, but we sometimes fail to look at work coming out of other disciplines, even within the humanities, with that same complexity that we look at it within our own. So I guess that's something to be mindful of, and I hope I can kind of fold some of that into some of the discussion today and other work going forward. In cognitive science, cognition, it's no longer thought of something that just happens inside the skull. It's a kind of older view of cognition as something brain-bound, weird computations. You try and work out how they happen. Cognition now, there's heaps of interesting stuff looking at what's going on inside our brains in cognitive science, but cognition is more and more understood as something that happens in a body, in a place, in a period of time, in social circumstances, in a world, in a context. And I guess the more I get into that kind of way of looking at stuff in that literature, the more I start to think of intelligence as something that's embodied as well. And so I've started to think in terms of embodied intelligence, which I see as a set of abilities to really perceptively interpret and make use of information from our bodies, from our brains, from the environment around us, from the requirements of a task, and to use this to modulate or shape our focus or direct our awareness and action strategies accordingly. And I think this is critical for performing well-learned skills in really vulnerable situations, but also performing them for the first time or trying something new. And that's a thread that's going to weave through this presentation. So my aim today is just to share 3 case studies of embodied intelligence in action, and I hope that through doing that, it A, makes you think, wow, that's kind of cool. There's some interesting stuff going on here. And B, make you value the embodied intelligence you see in your own experiences and own interests and what that might bring to your own practical activities or other interests. I find I think best when I'm moving. So I designed a project to investigate embodied intelligence in action, and it involved taking my own body. If I can get this to play. So my body's been mountain biking for over 20 years at a reasonably high level in Australia, now and then overseas. This is one of our trails in Sydney, if you can see the video playing. And I wanted to know if some of the skills that I've developed in mountain biking, through mountain biking, including some of these cognitive skills, how they might carry over to learning a completely new task, and whether they would teach me things about skill learning or teach me things about the skills involved in skill learning, or even through being in a strange environment, maybe teach me things about mountain biking that felt so normal I just couldn't identify them anymore as unusual. So the outline for this talk today is to talk through some of the theoretical motivations for the trapeze project, to briefly chat through the method that I use to carry it out, and some project specifics. Most of the talk will be on 3 case studies that came from that project, some conclusions, a little note on some future work and some work that I've been doing at the same time. And then I'm really looking forward to discussion afterwards and hearing your take on things. So theoretical motivations. If minds aren't blank, then, and that's kind of an old view now, it's becoming a dated view, although it can still be popular in pop culture, and there is still research that's kind of advocating blankness, and they're producing some interesting stuff. But I just, if they're not blank, not all the time, then what are the many, many things that minds are doing? So there was in skill theory, so theories of skill in psychology, philosophy, cognitive science, what's called the classic view, which is the idea that we start learning something and there's a lot of kind of instructions and things to pay attention to, and we try and get our bodies to comply. And then there's various stages of competence as we get better. And then the hallmark of expertise in this kind of classic theories of skill is just being able to do stuff without even having to think about it. So automaticity is, the pinnacle of expertise, unless there's like really unusual or really challenging circumstances. In the last sort of less than a decade, hybrid theories of skill have just started to grow and explode, which is exciting because these theories, they say yeah, these kind of autonomous processes, our bodies, just like breathing is often thought of as an autonomous skill, although you can, shape and direct your breathing. But if we think of some of these processes that can happen without conscious intervention, especially all the time, they can be really integrated with deliberate awareness and control. So we think of top-down and bottom-up processes. And people working in this area are saying actually cognition remains in expert level performances. That's really important for things like situation awareness and strategic control and guiding action. So people working in this area have identified multiple roles for awareness and deliberate control. A couple that no one's really talked about a whole lot that I find a little bit strange and I hope I can contribute to. The first is awareness, like affect awareness or awareness of emotions or feelings or even the states that give rise to them. There's not a whole lot happening about that and the impact that might have on focus or attention or arousal or our attitudes to risk. Sometimes you can be really angry and then do risky things that you might not do if you're feeling quite happy. So I think that's something really interesting. Another one that no one really talks about, which I find quite strange, is for all this stuff about bodies and minds, no one's really talking about the variability of our actual physical bodies. So talk about intentional control and motor action schemas, but how does the body change if it's injured or if it's dehydrated or it's hungry or it hurts? So I think that's another area that we can kind of fold that into how we think about how we perform skillful things and how we guide our bodies and our minds as we do them. I've become quite interested in expertise and what's happening in experts and also the relationship of expert performance processes to what happens in developing experiences and other stages of learning, and how you can see something set up in one carry into the other, or identifying something here might help you see new things over there. Something that I find a little bit weird in this kind of literature is people tend to talk about a novice to expert. It almost comes across like a continuum, like, you knew at something and then you're really good at something. But I think, I don't know, like a lot of us, especially by adulthood, where, we have expertise in something and that changes how we might approach something new when we learn it. So if you've been driving a car for a while and then you decide to get your motorbike license and learn to ride a motorbike, there's some parts of what you take from the car driving experiences that are going to carry into your early learning experiences on the motorbike. And that might be navigating or monitoring the traffic or scanning the road for what other cars are doing. And then what you experience on the motorbike might actually carry into a kind of different or more refined awareness when you get back in the car. So I don't think it's as simple as, you're a novice or you're an expert. I think you can have novice experts and things in between. I think that's something that would be really interesting to look at more. And that was something I was interested in the trapeze project. A lot of the work in this area and theorists in this area are really hungry for studies that use methods that engage with real-world experiences of skilled performance. So a lot of this work can be quite abstract or take small examples of skillful behaviour, or it's very controlled so that it can be reproduced in the lab, or just pull out one element of performance and take it away from the others just to examine that. But then you miss the impact of everything else. So there's a kind of real hunger for good real-world studies. There's a tension for sure between what gets called ecological validity, what's actually real, what actually happens, and a sort of anxiety or a need in the sciences to be able to control certain variables. But I also think life isn't always neat or controllable or predictable, and a lot of performance situations certainly aren't. The Olympic Games isn't, or we know who won before people even got to the start line. So I think we really do need to look at that stuff, and that is happening. And I think it's a bit of a shame that sometimes people in these disciplines calling for these studies, they're maybe a little blind to some of the work that's been happening in other disciplines that does this stuff really well. I'd love to see more conversations happening between researchers. And I think theatre and performance studies has so much to offer in this area. There's a shared keen interest in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches to research and a genuine openness to using different approaches. It's a discipline that really builds amazing capacities for description and observation, of stuff in context. People in these disciplines have a lot of rich practical expertise to draw on in even just unpacking what they're seeing or unpacking case studies or creating their own research projects. And that is really valuable in kind of helping explain what's going on. There's amazing history in studying all kinds of performance processes, heaps of stuff on emotion throughout the centuries, lots on body awareness. And then the two areas I said I'd love to see more about, and I think we will. Like I said, it's just this huge, new growing area. Performance studies and theatre studies are great with movement. They're great with place. They're not shy about exploring complex subject matter in its messiness or just one-off events that can't be reproduced. They're great at getting at site, person, context specificity and getting at things that can't always be expressed exactly in words. And that's a struggle people have when they rely on interview-based methods, that words might not capture what's really going on, and people wonder if you can trust words. But I think in performance studies, we sometimes see words as an approximate expression or lived metaphors rather than exact and precise, and we can kind of get beyond that. The method I used for my own study comes from ethnography. So ethnography is interested in how activities are meaningfully constructed and accomplished in real-world situations. Cognitive ethnography is interested in just narrowing that to cognitive activities, but in these contexts. It's a method that you see a lot of participant observation, sometimes photo or video documentation, note-taking, and a kind of cyclical back and forth between observation and analysis, and testing that analysis against further observation and seeing what you see and going back and forth to get at it. I love this quote by Williams: "Undertaking a cognitive ethnographic study requires an act of faith, that the phenomena of interest will appear in the data, that they will be captured in a way that supports analysis, and that the findings will merit the considerable effort involved. And my favourite part, we will be surprised in ways that we cannot anticipate." And something important about ethnography is not going in knowing what you're going to find, it's seeing what emerges out of the data, and you can't always predict what that's going to be. I combined this with apprenticeship ethnography, which is sort of like using apprenticeship as an entry point into a community of practice. So unlike something like autoethnography, where the ethnographer's own experience is the object of study, in apprenticeship ethnography, it's learning that's the object of study. So it's a way of learning about learning. Now, ethnographic approaches are great for when there's not much research or knowledge on the phenomena in question, or if we need richer, thicker descriptions of the basic phenomena. We've got no clear theories to motivate experimental design, but it's great for coming up with things that we can then test by other methods and see where that goes. And it's also great for when the phenomena being studied are so complex and interconnected that they can't be easily isolated and still capture the thing that is. It's not... This is important to say, it's not the specific findings from ethnographic studies that generalise. My experiences on the trapeze, they're not generalisable to every person learning anything ever, or other aerialists doing aerial arts, or even me at trapeze, a year in the future. But what does generalise are the questions and the issues that this method raises in terms of theoretical concerns or the knowledge that's produced. So for this project, I started trapeze lessons in 2014, cut the breaks due to injuries and a global pandemic. I kept notes on new tricks, prompts for remembering them in future, which was quite hard, and challenging moments because they often reveal a lot about the strategies that work and don't work in skill learning, and keeping the Williams quote in mind, surprising moments. I coded the notes to reflect instances that might reveal flexible or interesting relationships between bodily and cognitive processes, just to see what kinds of things were coming up. And massive slide warning, so much stuff came up. And I don't expect anyone to try and read all this stuff, but my point is there was so much stuff that came up from this study, and that's lovely. In this presentation now, I'm going to focus on 3 of these things. So in the first case study, I'm going to look at self-regulation strategies that happened in skill learning. I'm going to look at the experience of cues for facilitating complex movement. And in the third one, the impact of physiological factors on action and control and being able to move in a certain way. So case study 1, the vampire moment. This moment happened about a year, just over a year into the project, and it took that long to develop the skills and strength to be able to do this trick that I'd seen in about week 2. I'd seen another student do it, and I really wanted to be able to do it too. So I got the green light to do it. And the hardest part about this trick, it's called the triple roll down, is having the strength and skills to be able to kind of pull yourself up on the trapeze and wrap yourself around enough times that you end up kind of 2 stories up in the air. And you can see in the freeze frame for this video that the trapeze is actually wrapped around the pelvis. It's tight enough that it's digging in and causing bruises. The trick itself is just holding the arms back, leaning back and opening the arms to stop the fall. So this video works. Kieran, can you give a little head nod if that worked? Oh, great. So that was the triple roll down. Now, when I first tried the triple roll down, these are my field notes now, I'd been binge watching a vampire TV series. And then one day I stepped out into our lounge room and into the warm sun, and a voice appeared in my mind. And it said, and this always feels a little bit awkward to say, but I've given it away in the title. This voice in my head said, "I'm not a vampire." And it was firm, but caring and matter of fact. "I'm not a vampire." It was a reminder that I wouldn't burn and die, and to get outside more. As I jumped up to the trapeze to attempt this trick for the first time, the same week as that lounge room sunshine moment, I performed a series of moves to spin up to a sitting and then a standing position on the bar. As I performed these preliminary moves, those words came again, "I'm not a vampire." And it felt like a reminder that I wasn't immortal and that the risks were high if I didn't pay the right kind of attention to this upcoming task. So earlier that week, the vampire moment was a surprise. It felt linked to a little bit of guilt about watching TV instead of writing research papers, but it also felt protective. It's a kind voice. At the trapeze school, the weirdness of the voice had dissipated, but the protective element remained. Now, in the trapeze context, there was a familiar feeling of fear. I went outside, I went to the toilet and I calmed down. And when I came back in, the feeling in the room had shifted before trying this trick for the first time. And it sort of reminded me of, when everyone starts psyching each other up. And I'd felt this feeling before, trying some steep obstacle on the bike or going canyoning and having to jump off a rock into unfamiliar water. But I've become pretty sensitized to the kind of casualness and excitement that can come together with using just being really psyched as a strategy. And I've seen too many people in mountain biking just get so psyched up that they stop paying attention to what else is going on, to the risky parts of what they're about to do, and bad crashes happen. A focus that's too relaxed or casual can be really catastrophic when you're doing scary things. So I find a strategy that works for me when I feel that feeling is to start taking note of the features of the environment that would be bad to land on. So mountain biking, maybe some sharp rocks or the edge of a cliff face. And then I start noting, the things that I need to do to navigate them safely. And this causes a slight rise in anxiety, but it also increases focus and a sense of control. So it stops the anxiety rising too much. Now, my fear that felt familiar in the trapeze context, it wasn't about doing the trick. My fear was that I wasn't scared enough about the consequences if I got it wrong. So I'm not a vampire with a person-specific, situation-specific, context-specific cue to lift my anxiety, respect the apparatus, and sharpen focus. How I want to feel before entering a rock garden on the bike prompted an appraisal and a modulation of a physiological readiness before trying this move on the trapeze. And it's kind of interesting. We think of, let me think how to put this. So anxiety, when it's, in some forms or at some levels, can be really inhibitive. You can run or freeze, but sometimes it can, your heart rate rises, adrenaline rises, blood vessels constrict, pupils dilate, focus increases, sense of pain dulls, and these are all really handy things when you want to do something with acuity. So for me, it was kind of a really interesting kind of top-down manipulation of these processes we think of as quite autonomous. In academia and popular culture, people talk about anxiety like it's a bad thing, and there's a lot of things that aren't good about anxiety. And this comes up, in choking literature. Anxiety is seen as the enemy of skill coping. Not all of it. There's some that is saying there are some rules for anxiety. In the emotion regulation literature, anxiety is often talked about as something that's down-regulated rather than up-regulated. So there's this interesting review of a whole lot of psychological literature on emotion regulation by Bonanno and Burton, and they say, most of the time people down-regulate. There's some studies that look at cases where people with neurotic dispositions do better in tests when they lift anxiety, but Bonanno and Burton question whether this is really that effective given some of the other challenges of neurotic dispositions. But they don't look at skilled emotion regulators. Most of the studies they talk about, I think, are talking about people with complex bereavement or depression. But the vampire moment to me suggests, I don't know, I think sometimes raising anxiety can be key to performance success in certain circumstances and in certain people. And I think more research should investigate the individual and really weird ways that some people arouse emotions like anxiety, which are considered negative or distracting, to facilitate optimal performance. And I think, we can look at skilled emotion regulators to do this. We can look at actors would be really interesting, not just their own understanding of emotion, but that of a character as well, and how you kind of work with the two. Or sports people or psychotherapists who have to regulate the expression of their own emotions when they're working with a patient. So is this a case of the mind being blank? Well, I don't know, like in some ways on the surface, it's like, sure, thinking about vampires, it's not thinking about the trapeze. So it makes distraction theories in choking look quite attractive. But I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's not the vampire moment that's significant. It's out of everything that's happening in the performance context that I made a choice to pay attention to that thought and then use that thought to tune in to the task at hand in an embodied way and induce a certain sense of readiness before attempting the task. So I think there's actually something really interesting going on here that is quite mindful. Case study 2. So case study 2 it's actually the same trick, but doing the trick. So you can try it this time. So you can do it sitting or you can stand up, but the trick itself is just you need to put your arms up in the air and just do it because it's easy and it's fun and you should just do it. But so pop your arms up in the air, and in a minute when I tell you, you're going to gently lean back to initiate the fall, and you're going to rotate once, twice, and all you have to do to stop it is open your arms. So you ready? So gently initiate once, twice, open your arms. Great, you did it. Easy. But it's not, it's so scary when you're up there to just have to open your arms. Like, what if your arms don't open? How can you make sure they're going to open? So that's what I'm interested in this second case study. Oh, that's a big slide. I'll go back for a sec. So my field note on this second case study is before we did the triple roll down, the coach Carla, she said, okay, let's just do it once. Let's just we'll try it once and then we'll build it into the 3. So she was very specific about what to do and why, focusing on a couple of things to keep in mind that would let the rest of it flow. Keep your legs straight, pelvis dish, everything tight. If you go floppy, it'll throw you around more. So in my mind, I trusted just to stay tight. Whatever it feels like, just focus on staying tight. And open your arms wide. They'll catch you after one turn. We'll start with just one turn. Body tight, arms wide, one turn, it'll all be good. My inner thoughts. Gently initiate when you're ready by leaning back a fraction, Carla said. Body tight, arms wide. I really wanted to get it done. Okay, go. Caught. Awesome. So this is a mega slide because it's got a lot of references on it. What's interesting about the instructions from Coach Carla was that she didn't talk about every single element of the movement, but very specific things to focus on to encourage what I'd call the successful invention of the movement. Now, verbal maxims or cues or instructional nudges have been shown to align or realign complex actions in sports like cricket, and I've shown this in mountain biking. So John Sutton writes in cricket the phrase "watch the ball," even though really skilled players have been shown to take their eyes off the ball quicker than novice players, the phrase "watch the ball" actually encourages a whole of body movement quite effectively. So a familiarity with using these cues, thinking through their implications through mountain biking, through trusting them, it kind of really helped me do it in this other context. And it helped with communication to refine the approach to the task. And it also helped not let the anxiety get too high and have a sense of control. So I tried it once, and then Carla says, all right, do it again, but with your eyes open. Ooh, I hadn't even realised I'd closed them. But this is important because when you do this trick in performance, you're not just watching the room spin around, you're watching the cables pass your visual field. So you're counting them. You see them once, you see them twice. It's a visual cue to open your arms. And then, you know, in this training situation, she's also yelling open. So there's an oral cue to open your arms. And then there's bodily sensations to kind of layer into this. Pelvis dish, something I'd heard in other classes and in a physio-chiro context dealing with injuries, body tight. And then later, shoulders engaged on the opening to stop the rope burn that happened on the really floppy example that you saw in the video. So these cues are multimodal and they become layered or overlapping or parallel in our experience. Okay, so there's some interesting research from psychology by Erickson and Kinch, and they're interested in experts' capacity to extend the capacity of their short-term working memory. So short-term working memory typically is seen to hold maybe 7 things, but experts can just hold enormous amounts of, or recall enormous amounts of information. And Erickson and Kinch say they do this by using retrieval cues in short-term memory that access information held in long-term memory. And they call this skilled use of long-term working memory. Sorry, they call the skilled use of long-term memory as long-term working memory. Now, I mean, I kind of relate to this through mountain biking. So if I'm looking at a racetrack before racing it, I'll see a section of fire road and I'll go, okay, every time I get to that fire road, each lap, I'm going to see that road and it's a reminder to take a drink so I don't get dehydrated later in the race. And when I see this section of track, that's a reminder to really put the power down and gain some extra time. And when I come up to this strange looking rock that's got a bit of a crack down it, that's going to remind me to go just to the left of the crack, and then there's a smooth bit of rock and then a little dip and then a sort of puddle of mud that's not that bad and then a quick left-hand corner. So you can start to see how these are just visual cues, but they're triggering all kinds of action. Yeah. And why this is interesting, why their theory is interesting, is one of the criticisms against, or one of the reasons against why there's no cognition in expert experience of action is people say in that camp, you're thinking slow, it's effortful, it's clunky. But long-term working memory theory is like, well, here's a way that thinking can actually be quite rapid and give people access to all kinds of information. Now, the case studies that Erickson and Kinch use are typically things that can be done while sitting pretty still, so chess, recalling number sequences, or medical diagnosis, but more, I think it's more about facts rather than what you might see in the patient or what you might feel through palpation. And some of the techniques that they discuss are also fairly abstract, like chunking. But this case study demonstrates that these cues are multimodal. They're sights, sounds, sensations. They can be very context, situation, person specific. And they can be used not just to trigger memory of facts, but also embodied action. And they can assist with focus and adjusting focus or plans. It also shows, so Erickson and Kinch talk about these cues being something that happens in experts, but I mean, this case study shows that these cues are set up even at very early levels. And this is done in anticipation of a more sophisticated series of cues happening in performance. So, you know, while the triple roll down might happen 3 minutes into a 5-minute routine, you know, in the rest of that 5 minutes, there might be cues from the music that let you know how on track you are with the routine, if you need to slow down or speed up, or the sway of the cables might sort of mean you need to steady the trapeze before you start the next move, or fatigue might mean you just need to take a breath for a minute so that your arm strength doesn't fade. Or you might be using cues from the people around you to coordinate movement, or applause from the audience at an unexpected point of time to kind of just, again, modulate what you're doing a little bit more. So there's all these different things happening in performance that stop you needing to remember the roadmap for everything to do, but keep you on task and keep you safe if they're protecting you from getting a bit carried away with stuff. I think this also shows that, so Erickson and Kinch say that, you know, these strategies are task specific, but I think actually no, I think some of these capacities do carry over to alternate tasks or alternate domains, provided that they're relevant to skill execution in these other areas. So again, is this a case of the mind being blank? You know, cues aren't always words. They might be just a sight or a sound or a sway or a feeling. But that's still something that we're noticing, and then we're making decisions according to this. So it might feel like blankness. It might feel like just being in this lovely zone without long sentences for thoughts, but I think there's an awful lot going on. And I think actually these cues in a lot of cases are keeping minds in performance rather than wandering away and riding over the wrong rock or doing a move when you're not quite ready to do it. So I think, again, there's something really interesting going on here. Case study 3. So this one, I think it's a bit of a longer field note for this one, so I'll just stop the slide for a minute. So there was a really long gap, about 2 years between case studies. About 2 weeks after the triple roll down, I had a small accident at trapeze class and I knocked out my front teeth. And that meant a year of surgery and a year of soup. And I eventually got back to trapeze, but I flipped backwards off my bike and landed on my pelvis and my phone and a very delicious biscuit. My phone was okay, and the biscuit was terrific. I ate it about half an hour later, but the damage to my sacrum and my pelvis, that meant I couldn't sit on chairs for about 8 months. And when you can't sit on chairs, a lot of other things start to get quite worn out and sore as well. So I got a lot worse before I started to improve. The method of physiotherapy that started to help when other things weren't is the Connect therapy model, which integrates the thoracic ring approach developed by L.J. Lee. Now, as part of this treatment approach, when appropriate, patients are taught to develop neuromuscular control over the muscles around the kind of rib area, or what's called in this context the thoracic rings. To assist with this, the physio might release tight muscles or manipulate particular joints into place to give the patient a sensorial understanding of what a more optimal bodily experience feels like. And this can be incredibly transformative when it comes to pain. Imagery and cues help the patient to develop the muscle control for themselves to achieve this embodied experience. And it's kind of interesting that cues and imagery needed. I mean, you never even have to learn the name of the muscle or the joints or what it specifically does. You lose a lot of agency when things get like that. You slowly let go of the desire and capacity for a collection of tasks at a time. And to heal, all kinds of people have access to your body in ways that are very different to the social codes that govern healthier, more robust lives. My body's been pathologized, medicalized, medicated, manipulated, judged, assessed, trained, retrained. I remember one appointment where 3 physios, 3 extraordinary minds, 3 skill sets of hands, they manipulated different parts of my body into place. My role was just to stand there and breathe. As part of the healing process, I've learned to cue different muscles and joints into position through a series of evolving metaphors. I can spread imaginary cake mix horizontally at the level of my bra strap, and that increases the space between my 5th, 6th and 7th rings, so the 5th, 6th, 7th rib. So I've been walking around with a lot of cake. Sometimes it's a wet dish rag. Foam balls grow under my armpits and they help me stack rings 2 and 3. And then some days there's these little race cars parked along the top of my spine, and they rev their engines, but they never leave the gate, and they can pull me into a line from above. And if that's not working, I sometimes let water run vertically up my back under my scapula and then kind of down the front. I've learned to cognitively intervene in implementation control at such a subtle level, activating muscles around my hip that had atrophied so much we had to guide them back on with an ultrasound. So I went back to trapeze at a different movement school this time. It had a bit of a more flexible timetable in case I couldn't stick to the classes. Now, looking at the bar, I suddenly realised that after such an intensive period of physio and such a long time away from this environment, I no longer knew which parts of me were weak and which parts were strong. In cognitive science, we talk about declarative knowledge, knowing that, so conceptual or descriptive knowledge. When we talk about procedural knowledge, knowing how, embodied knowledge. But for some reason, we talk a lot less about the dynamic influence and physiological freedoms. For some reason, we talk a lot less about the dynamic influence that physiological freedoms and constraints have on these processes. I might know how to do a move. I might have done it 1,000 times. I might be able to tell you how to do it and visualize it, feel myself doing it to a certain extent as I do. But here and now, in this specific situation, halfway through this move, I might not have the strength to complete it anymore. So what do? Do I fall? Can I get back out of it? Can I somehow compensate or change the move partway through if I need to? Several months of physio has taught me that my usual compensations, they're not as effective as I once thought they were. So how do I recalibrate my sense of risk? Carefully filling out this current body on the bar, I found that the weakest point and the most common limiting factor was grip strength. I used to have enough grip strength to hold to get through a 1-hour lesson more, but I could now feel that strength quickly fade about 20 minutes into a class. So lesson 3, David, not his real name, a teacher with many years' experience, taught the class a new move. This move was new for me too. He lowered the static trapeze so that it was close to the ground, maybe 2.5 feet off the ground. And this allowed students to just step off the bar if they needed to. So one by one, everyone got up and they tried this new trick. I went last. He'd seen that I was a certain amount of strong from previous lessons, but he could also see my hesitation. I don't know if he remembered that I'd mentioned the lack of grip strength, or if it was something he anticipated, having seen it in several others. It's a pretty common limiting factor in a lot of beginners. But as I prepared to do the trick, he asked me, gesturing, if I'd like him to put his hand on the cable under mine to stop my hand sliding. So if he held it there, my hand wouldn't slip. So I considered his offer. And I made the choice to do the trick on my own. And in that moment, I felt agency returning. And so I stood on the bar. I'm not sure if I can show you. stood on the bar, and I held those cables and I cued my rings into place. The cues changed a little bit recently. And then I lifted I felt as I did that, I felt the muscles around my shoulder kind of relax into a position that would let that shoulder be strong. So then I lifted my hypermobile leg up over my arm and held onto the cable, and I let go, and I felt so free. And I swung, and I felt happy, and it felt beautiful, and I felt excited, and I just couldn't wait to see and discover what doing my body might reveal next. So what did it reveal? Many things. So this case study shows that sometimes environments and artifacts act on us, and the effects of this can sometimes be reversible. So one of the reasons I couldn't hold the cables anymore was that I'd lost all the calluses that had increased my capacity to grip in the past. Gail Salomon, she writes about this case study on arthritis, and she describes this frequent bodily scanning process, so checking in on muscles and joints and movement plans before doing even everyday tasks like walking down the stairs or, doing something in the kitchen. And this kind of scanning process is what I felt myself doing on the trapeze, scanning my body, checking joints, alignment, muscle activation, various experiences of the absence and presence of pain. And anxiety was a really important prompt for checking in if I thought I might be able to do this. And what's interesting in this example is the downregulation of that anxiety. That was something collaboratively mediated through the teacher's gesture, putting his hand on the cable. So it's distributed between, myself and the teacher and this object here. It's not just a regulation of anxiety happening just in me. This case study also, it's a reminder that our skillful capacities, we can't always trust them. Just because we've done something once, it doesn't mean we can do it forever and ever or even again. Now, Salomon, she critiques theories of skill for their progressive kind of way they conceive of skill, that we're always getting incrementally better. And she says, no, in the case studies I'm writing about here, or anyone, if they're lucky to live long enough, there's also regression. So she describes about more of an arc. But I think, yes, but it's more than that. Our capacities vary all the time. I think it looks more like this. And it's not a literal example. Some people really took me to task on this. I just think, I don't know, I think, sometimes we develop in one area and then we lose something in another, and then we might go in another direction entirely. Or sometimes even over the space of a day, we might be really good at something and then get hungry or tired or worn out or angry, and we can't do the thing that we were able to do really well 2 hours ago. And part of the craft of anyone trying to do these things or stay safe is to check in and decide, can I do it now? Is it safe? So is this a case of the mind being blank? Well, no. I'm going to say no. I think this case study's got everything. It's got cues, it's got emotion regulation distributed this time, and it's got this kind of scanning of body and world and task. And it's kind of interesting because there's almost like a roaming of our minds between these different things and picking up and working with things that might help us get a task done or things that might be getting in the way of it. So I think our minds have incredible capacities that we're doing in these things. And I don't think that's limited to training. I think, sometimes in performance too, we have moments where we're going to do something that's a little bit scary and we have certain checks and cues and backup plans in mind. Or sometimes things just go wrong. People talk about the show goes on, but what happens when the show goes on? Or you have a wardrobe failure, or a co-performer doesn't do something that's planned, or you get an injury that flares up partway through. I think there's all kinds of kind of flexible adaptation going on to kind of stick to an overarching plan. So I talked at the beginning about embodied intelligence. There's a set of abilities to perceptively interpret and make use of information from body, mind, environment, task requirements. and to use this to modulate focus, awareness and action strategies accordingly. And I hope that these case studies have kind of shown a few examples of embodied intelligence in action. I don't think this happens all the time, and I don't think it's as simple as just one thing at a time, but I think it's a really interesting phenomenon to think more about. And I think it's critical for performing skills in a range of situations, and I think it's critical for keeping safe. So conclusions. Our skillful capacities are dynamic, they're not linear or always progressive, and they're wonderfully weird and personal. Effective awareness, kinesthetic awareness, self-regulation, they're really important components of expert skill sets and developing skill sets. Cues are multimodal, and some of the earlier research I mentioned on cues does look at multimodal cues, but it's new to think about how these multimodal cues help us facilitate recall and embodied action under pressure using long-term working memory theory. Can see the roles of embodied intelligence in navigating all of these challenges, and these challenges are familiar to performers, but maybe not to some theorists. And I think some aspects of embodied intelligence do transfer between domains. And I think that studying the ways that risk and vulnerability are negotiated in training can teach us a lot about peak performance processes. And I think if there's one take-home message from this talk, it's that our bodies and minds are incredible and we should thank them more often for the amazing things they do. Now, I think if we learn to value some of these strategies and processes, we can better understand how people of all types negotiate high-stakes challenges rather than just sensationalizing them. Some research I read on the trapeze just talked about death as a consequence of getting something wrong, but let's look at the in-between and what goes on. And also, take this stuff seriously rather than underplaying it and just say, I just did it, I don't know, it just happened. I think, well, okay, but, what might have helped it have more chance of going right? If you're interested in this stuff, some work that's been happening alongside it, there's a paper on other methodological approaches to looking at skill that recently came out. There's some theory building work that I've been doing with Wayne and John, and also Doris McElwain. And Wayne's great. He lets me take him mountain biking to kind of think about the theory a little more. So the paper I've put there is a fairly popular one on that stuff. Parts of this paper are coming out soon in the Review of Philosophy and Psychology. And also really exciting is John and I are editing a book on collaborative embodied performance, which should come out next year. And it's exciting because it's really expanding these transdisciplinary dialogues. So there's people from all these different disciplines that we find really interesting contributing to this book, with case studies from Muay Thai and Kapa Haka and front of house at the new Globe Theatre and architecture. So that's pretty exciting to see more people talking with each other about some of these ideas. I've been working with Christina Brummer, a sports sociologist at the University of Oldenburg, on handstands and elephants. Elephants being a metaphor, not real elephants, that would have been fun. And soon about to do a little field study with some mountain bikers to look at how they make decisions and adjust what they're doing while they're riding, integrating methods from a couple of different places, some qualitative and quantitative work. And I really hope to keep looking at embodied intelligence in sport communities and communities where moving is medicine, to keep people healthy. And just a final thing, I was just thinking as I wrote this presentation, what does this research offer back to theatre and performance studies? And I hope that if it's interesting to you, it might add to the sort of analytical toolkit to unpack some of the things that are going on in other examples or interests or case studies. And I tend to think of performance theory as always giving people something to add to a practical toolkit, to just sort of help scaffold performance when it's not just happening by itself, or, in situations like some of these where you really don't want to rely on it just happening. And I hope that this work helps build increased disciplinary confidence about what different types of thinkers and practitioners and people from different areas, what they have to offer some of these debates. And And I hope that it helps people just really value what their own embodied awareness brings to the many things that they do, and how participation in one area might really shape participation in another in some exciting ways. And mostly I'd love to hear from other people, so please get in contact and tell me your thoughts. And I'd really love to hear what you see in this material, or how it helps you see interesting things in other areas that you're interested in. So that's me, and thank you very much.